So, you want to build an electric car? Okay, here's a tutorial. I have average mechanical skills and a very modest knowledge of automobile mechanics. But I learned to read a long time ago, and being retired, I was looking for a challenging project to serve as brain candy. So I started reading about other people's experiences in building electric cars. The idea interested me, and I even bought a couple of manuals on the subject that I really found were outdated and not much help at all. I did find that perusing the internet was by far the best source of information, and I learned that there are some very knowledgeable and experienced suppliers out there and EV builders out there who are willing to help. The first challenge, of course, was to find an affordable donor car, a car that was acceptable of holding a large and heavy battery array, one that would keep its value and still be nice enough to drive when the project was completed. I looked at several cars as potential donors. The list included a 1998 Mitsubishi 3000 GX that had modest body damage, and a 2002 Mitsubishi Eclipse that had steering and suspension problems. They looked kind of nice, but I also checked out 5 or 6 others. I really got very lucky because I ended up with a pristine 2004 Crossfire. I chose that car for several reasons. It was a sporty two-seater that was in perfect cosmetic shape. It was also a car that I'd like to drive at the end of the project, and one that I hoped would retain its worth. The gas tank was located behind the front seat of the car, with trunk space beyond that. So I realized that it provided lots of room for batteries once the gas tank would be removed. It had rear-wheel drive, and I kind of understood those mechanics. And it had a 6-speed manual transmission. The engine compartment was also quite roomy. Everything on the car worked, from the lights to the pop-up spoiler on the trunk lid, to the seats, to the lights. Everything worked perfectly. The big negative for the usual car buyer was that the engine had over 260,000 miles. But that wasn't a negative for me. Best of all, it made it more affordable. So I bought it on the spot and drove it home. I would have bought it even if the engine was blown and I had to have it towed home. At roughly the same time, it was necessary to make a decision about the motor and the battery system that would power the car. Regular 48-volt batteries weigh about 90 pounds each, and the same size lithium-ion battery weighs about 43 pounds. And they both deliver the same 48 volts. So it was a really no contest decision. Lithium-ion batteries won hands down. They are much more expensive, but since they weigh considerably less, they take up less room and deliver more power and distance in amp hours. It was, as I say, a no-brainer. After reviewing a number of quotes from EV suppliers, I planned to use a 144-volt AC51 motor and controller produced by Curtis. Once I had made that decision, I knew that I had to eventually develop a battery pack that could deliver that 144 volts. So those specs were the basics I started with. I knew the job was going to take some time and that lithium batteries were very expensive. So procuring the batteries was going to be last on the list. The really next big step was to carefully pull the engine without damaging the other systems in the rest of the car or dinging the fenders. That was well beyond my skill set, and I found a mobile automobile mechanic who was willing to come to the job and help me remove the gas motor. To make that job doable, I bought a hydraulic lift and 4 jack stands on sale at Harbor Freight. My friend Dave came over, and the 3 of us had that motor out of the car and on a dolly in a little over 4 hours. Then, over the next several weeks, I removed all of the other things associated with the gas motor. The gas tank, the exhaust system, the radiator, and the radiator fan were all removed. The alternator, the power steering pump, and the power brake pump were removed with the motor. The transmission was also carefully removed for future modification. As the last step in this process, we took the car off the jack stands, pushed the chassis out of the garage, and pressure washed and cleaned the entire engine compartment. Then we pushed it back into the garage and put it back up on the jack stands for the duration of the project. Fortunately, with the help of Craigslist, I was able to sell the engine and most all of the parts we had removed. I spent some time reading about the various options for dealing with the transmission and its connection to the motor. Some builders continue to use the clutch, and others favor eliminating the clutch and making a direct connection. After reading the pros and cons, I finally decided to eliminate both the clutch and the flywheel. Going to a direct drive eliminated substantial weight and takes advantage of an electric motor's ability to gradually increase torque. Electric cars generally drive in second or third gear most of the time, and shifting gears without a clutch just takes a little getting used to. Thank you, Synchromesh. There are several electric motor options available, but I had already decided on a 144 volt AC51 motor and controller produced by Curtis. I also spent a lot of time rounding up quotes on that motor and the multiple components that needed to make it run. The best decision I ever made in the entire process was going with the electric car parts company in Utah, as they became my principal supplier. They were not only a competitive supplier, but they were a guiding light throughout the entire building process. I'd still be looking at an empty engine compartment if it weren't for them. The next big step was to fabricate the parts necessary to marry the motor to the transmission. There are a good number of stock parts solutions available depending on the car you had selected as a donor. Unfortunately, there were no stock connectors available for the Crossfire. The electric car parts company could easily have manufactured the necessary parts, but the process and the shipping costs would eat up a lot of budget. So I was lucky enough to find a local machine shop wizard by the name of Paul at Tempa Technique, who was willing to take on the job. I supplied some technical background material and photos from the internet and took the transmission and the motor to him. In a few days, he had made the precision parts that brought the motor and the transmission together perfectly. With the help of my friendly hydraulic lift, I returned the transmission to the car and rebolted it to the drivetrain. Then I lowered the motor into the compartment and bolted the machine parts to the motor. I had previously fashioned brackets to hold the motor in place and in line with the transmission. Working off a schematic that was put together by the electric car parts company for my project, I started to assemble the many component parts that are necessary to feed and care for the motor and the computer controller that runs it. To make sure that the controller does not overheat, it rests on a cooling plate, and I attached a separate cooling system to that plate. In working with the schematic, I found that it's important to recognize the power dichotomy that exists in an EV. There is the 12-volt system that powers the ignition and all of the accessories, Then there is the 144 volt traction system that pushes the car. The original 12 volt system was essentially intact, so that at the suggestion of the electric car parts company, I decided to create a magic box to house all those 144 volt components that were needed to push the car. That way, all of the high voltage components could be nicely organized in one place. I found that the best and cheapest source of this lot of the smaller parts was eBay. Some shops that specialize in electric car building offer package deals on components, which really aren't deals. So eBay turned out to be an excellent source and a much more economic source of the smaller components. A couple of exceptions were the smart battery charger that I bought from the electric car parts company, which ultimately came from China, along with the special J1772 charging port and the compatible nozzle. The J1772 parts have become the industry standard for charger access in the outside world. It's critical that you spend whatever time it takes to do the space layout and placement of the components and create adequate space for all of the various pieces, not only in the magic box, but also in the motor compartment and the trunk as well. I laid them out and moved them around a bunch of times, the same as you would do with a house floor plan before I got it right. In the motor compartment of the Crossfire, I asked a friend and welder, Dan Farmer, to build an adjustable stainless steel rack to hold the batteries in the front of the compartment and just in front of the motor. He created a substantial one that could be bolted to the frame and remain adjustable to accommodate battery size. Then I built an aluminum rack to hold the magic box and the smart charger in a position over the motor. I also bought an online Crossfire service manual that proved to be indispensable. The Crossfire had all the usual components and a host of creature comforts. Chief among them were power brakes, power steering, and air conditioning. A large EV builder and supplier out in California called EV West had created a belt-driven bolt-on unit that holds those components, the power steering pump, the power steering brakes pump, and the air compressor, the AC compressor. It was designed and fit, it was designed to fit the front of the Curtis 51 motor with dual shafts. So I ordered one of those units, and several months later, after many unkept promises, I got it delivered. It was a usable unit, but didn't really conform to what I had ordered, and came missing a belt drive and specs. I also used caution in dealing with EV West. With the help of my friendly hydraulic jack once again, I lowered the unit into place and bolted it to the motor. Bolts not supplied by EV West, by the way. The unit's big drawback is that everything stops when the motor stops, but in practice that isn't a particularly strong drawback. Another option that you may consider is running those pumps with small electric motors. I had a stroke of luck when I found out that the accelerator pedal on the Crossfire was fly-by-wire, which means that there is no mechanical linkage between the accelerator pedal and the the physical linkage to the car. The trick was to locate the existing wiring from the pedal in the engine compartment and connect it to the proper leads from the controller that handled speed. Thank you, Crossfire Service Manual. Earlier, I had taken the time to tag the wiring when we had pulled the engine, and so that was readily available, and I could make those connections fairly easily. As the various parts started to come together, The search for batteries truly began in earnest and took quite a while. I found that lithium-ion batteries can cost as much as the car itself. My objective was to get about 60 miles on a charge, and there is a formula that will tell you what you need to have in order to deliver that results. The curb weight of the car was 3,200 pounds before the removal of the gas tank, engine, radiator, flywheel, and exhaust system. So I made the assumption that I would be adding back roughly the same amount of weight or slightly less. The rule of thumb formula states that you need 100 watts per mile for every 1,000 pounds. So the math told me that I would need 3,200 watts divided by the motor's voltage, 140 volts, to get 2.2 amps per mile. Since I wanted to get a minimum of 60 miles, I would need at least 132 amp hours. So my batteries would have to deliver at least 132 amp hours. And to keep range anxiety at a minimum, I wanted a bit more. Once again, I got very, very lucky. I found a guru, a battery guru out in California, who steered me to the traction batteries of the Chevy Volt. They were ideal in many ways. The large master battery packs of the Volt could be broken down into individual 48 and 24 volt batteries. They were compact in size, approximately 9.5 inches by 9 inches by 11.5 inches. And the 48 volt battery weighed only 42 pounds. They had an actual positive and negative terminal posts and a tap for the battery management system. But the best of all was that they were 45 amp hours each. Considering the layout of the Volt pack, I recognized that I needed to dismantle them from the larger units and reconfigure them into 4 banks of 3 48 volt batteries wired in series. Then the 4 banks would be wired together in parallel. That would provide 144 volts and 180 amp hours. To make that configuration, I needed to buy 2 Chevy Volt traction batteries. I found them on eBay for $5,000, including shipping. They both arrived on one enormous pallet. Removing the protective covering and taking them apart was time-consuming, but it wasn't particularly difficult. Chevy didn't short on the number of bolts it used to keep the battery protected, and it took a lot of time to get them apart. Once apart and separated into individual batteries, the rods that were holding them together were no longer in place, and the bases of the batteries expanded. I used 1/4-inch stainless steel threaded rod to hold the batteries in their new configuration and reduce them to the original size. I later sold the unused 48 and 24 volt batteries for about $1,100 and recouped some of the original cost. As I mentioned previously, I also sold the motor, exhaust system, radiator fan, and assorted crossfire parts. Once I had the batteries configured into 4 banks of 3 48 batteries each, the hydraulic lift made positioning the banks into the car an easy matter. 1 bank went into the motor compartment and 3 went into the trunk. The batteries placed the weight very nicely over the rear wheels of the car. Since the batteries were such an expensive part of the project, it seemed prudent to install some form of battery management system, or BMS. There are quite a few options available depending on what data you need to have. Not being very sophisticated in this area and believing in the KISS principle, that is, keep it simple, stupid, I opted for a system that simply monitored each cell in the battery pack and kept that battery protected from over and undercharge. In essence, each cell in each battery got an individual BMS. Such an arrangement can be very expensive, but I found the right electronic boards and a little case to hold them on eBay. Then my battery guru in California expertly soldered the plug leads to the battery leads for me, as I would have burned them all to a crisp. All I had to do then was mount the boards in the small boxes, wire the positive side of each battery, and plug them into the BMS tap on top of the battery. I used adhesive gel to hold the small boxes to the battery tops. Amazingly, everything turned out okay and tested okay, and we were ready for the first real test drive. My two sons came down, one from Washington, D.C. and one from Austin, Texas, and we took turns driving it around the neighborhood. It had taken a year, but I had the first, I think, Crossfire electric. It kept an old man busy for a year and cost under $20,000.